teyamba okutubeezaawo ffe tuliwo ku lwa ttaka. Ettaka lyonna eb'ebinazi balitutte. Tulina ennaku y'amaanyi nnyo. Obutonde bw'ensi babutumazeeko. Batututteko ebibira byaffe byonna babitemye. Ekyokulabirako twatambulanga nga tetwekengera n'akamu. Naye kaakati tutambula tutya? Bwe bakusanga ng'oyita awatayitwa, kibi nnyo. Tetukyafuna luku. Enku abaana bwe bagenda mu kibira babagobayo. Tuwulira nga tukosebwa nnyo. Batuggyeko eddembe lyaffe ery'obwomuntu.
This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Barbara Sarah. This is the Al Jazeera News Hour live from London. Thank you for joining us. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, in Afghanistan, a Taliban government takes shape and talks begin to reopen Kabul's international airport. Claims of bribery and brutality. Afghan interpreters say they were blocked from leaving Kabul by special units funded by the U.S. government. Areas of the northeastern U.S. submerged by the remains of Hurricane Ida. More than 20 people have been confirmed dead. And remembering the Greek composer who came to symbolize political resistance, Mikis Theodorakis, has died at the age of 96.
And I'm Gemma Nash with sport. Qualifying for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar continues, with European champions Italy held to a surprise 1-1 draw by Bulgaria.
We begin the news hour in Afghanistan, where just days after the final U.S. troops left the country, the Taliban is expected to soon announce the formation of a new government. What form that administration takes could define the way the country's new rulers engage with the world. The UK government says it has no plans to recognize the Taliban government, but is ready to engage directly with the group. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab was speaking in Doha after talks with Qatar's Foreign Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. Also on the agenda, how to reopen Kabul airport. Jamal El Shayal has more from Doha.
The Qatari Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani confirmed that a technical team from his country was deployed to Afghanistan roughly 24 hours ago. They're there to assess how to get that airport up and running. Obviously, a lot of it was destroyed either by the huge amount of crowds who descended on it or intentionally by the occupying American forces as they left there. So it does require some sort of reconstruction or rebuilding. But the more important one is who is going to be running it, who is going to be manning it. And to that, the Qatari Foreign Minister said that his government was in talks with the Turks as well as obviously the Taliban, the new rulers on the ground, to come up with some sort of a mechanism, although that deal hadn't yet been finalized. He did indicate or point to the fact that they do expect something to be agreed within the coming days, which was corroborated to a certain extent by word we're hearing from sources inside of Afghanistan, who say the Taliban are hoping that domestic flights will be resuming in the next few days and possibly international flights within a week or so. A senior Qatari source told me that the initial flights that Qatar would be helping to operate would be either humanitarian or evacuation ones. That is their main focus for now, not necessarily civilian ones.
Well, Afghanistan's new government will face an economy on the brink of collapse. Prices of essential goods, including food and fuel, have soared, while the U.S. has frozen about $10 billion in national reserves, mostly held abroad. Nearly half of Afghanistan's population already rely on aid. Well, before the Taliban took over Afghanistan, 90% of the population lived in poverty. And with the flow of international aid trickling to a stop, 38 million Afghans are now facing food shortages. The UN says its stockpile of emergency food for hundreds of thousands of Afghans will be exhausted by the end of this month. And with winter approaching, the UN says it needs $200 million to feed the most vulnerable. It needs a total of $1.3 billion for its overall aid efforts. Plus, the World Health Organization says it needs medicine for hospitals, food for malnourished children, and supplies for COVID-19 measures. The WHO stressed that hospitals across Afghanistan could soon run out of supplies. Charles Stratford has been to one of the busiest facilities in the capital, Kabul, and sent us this report.
We went to a dialysis ward here, people being treated on dialysis machines. The doctors very concerned there. This, in fact, is a World Bank-funded project. They haven't received any money for about 3 months now. That means none of the staff have been paid. They're running very low on vital equipment and medicine in that department. One doctor said that if the people there being treated do not get treatment on a regular basis, they could die within 2 weeks. They also spoke about the fact that some medicines had arrived this morning, but only enough for a week. They were delivered by the organisation Médecins Sans Frontières, and they were actually for the emergency department, not the dialysis department here. Horrific scenes as well. One poor elderly woman on a stretcher, choking on her own blood in a terrible state, and the elevators don't work. Simple things like that. She was having to be taken up on a stretcher 4 stories to the ward to be treated. So horrific and worrying scenes there. We also went to the oncology department. Now, this department is funded, or was funded, by the former government. A similar scenario there. The budget had been signed off by the government, but they hadn't seen any money yet. Big concerns there that the Taliban were not going to sign off on this money for whatever reason, whether it be seeing that money could be used in a different sector. Again, salaries hadn't been paid. And death rates, mortality rates are going up all the time anyway. Certainly people dying from cancer, again, because of what people here say is the mismanagement of funds that should be put towards raising greater awareness. Many of the people coming to this hospital with stage 4 cancer and in a terrible state. So the situation here, certainly if this hospital, and as I say, it is the largest in Afghanistan, is anything to go by, the health sector in this country is hemorrhaging, and there are serious concerns that the withholding of international money could make things even worse.
Well, for more on the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, we can speak now to Laila Matar. She's the Advocacy and Media Director at the Norwegian Refugee Council and joins us live by Skype from Oslo. Madam, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. I don't know if you could hear our correspondent there, Charles Stratford, from a medical center in Kabul, really painting a dire picture of everything that's needed and how the situation could get much worse very soon. I know that the Norwegian Refugee Council is temporarily suspended its operation or paused it, but from the people on the ground, what are you hearing are the most pressing needs?
As you've been reporting and as we hear on the ground, I mean, this is a country that's edging ever closer to the brink of a major humanitarian disaster. You've already been reporting about the health situation. The food crisis is extremely dire. 1 in 3 people in the country is facing emergency levels of food insecurity. And people we speak to on the ground tell us exhausted stories about how they've had to sell farmland and move into displacement camps just to try to survive. Many families have gone into major debt just to feed themselves and their families. And with an economy in free fall the way it is, we only expect it to get worse, especially because the drought that is in the country is likely to intensify later in the year, causing even more food insecurity, not to mention, of course, that Afghanistan is a cold country. And without being able to provide enough humanitarian aid and prepare for the winter, we expect even worse and more dramatic scenes to be seen from Afghanistan, unfortunately.
There seems to be a lot of focus on trying to get the airport, Kabul International Airport reopened, which of course might help with some of the aid. But what would you say are the priorities right now? What should the focus be?
For us, there are 3 clear humanitarian imperatives and priorities at the moment. First of all, we need to make sure that we are allowed by the authorities to access those that are in need equally, that we're able to deliver food, water, shelter, sanitation to all men, women, boys, and girls equally. At the same time, we're looking to the international community to massively escalate its resources and humanitarian contributions to Afghanistan. There are organizations like mine that are on the ground, ready to stay and deliver and even escalate and scale up our efforts. But we need to see a major escalation in the humanitarian resources as well. And then finally, the countries in the region need support from Europe, from elsewhere, from the world to make sure that they can keep their borders open. They've been shouldering the responsibility. You know, the majority, millions of Afghans for many, many years have been in neighboring countries like Iran and Afghanistan, and they need support to be able to keep their borders open. While Europe, of course, needs to also share the responsibility and find ways to give Afghans safe passage so that they can have their asylum claims considered in Europe as well.
The Norwegian Refugee Council, like we mentioned a little earlier, has temporarily paused its work in Afghanistan. I understand you're waiting for assurances by the authorities that you'll be able to help the population. What kind of assurances are you waiting for? I mean, ultimately, we, over the next few days, should see what form the new Taliban government takes. What is it that you want to hear from them that will make you feel that you can resume the work you used to do?
We've received positive signals from the Taliban that we will be able to deliver aid and that we can do so equally, that both our male and female staff will be able to do so, and that they will be able to serve both men, women, boys, and girls equally when it comes to education and otherwise. Of course, we're waiting to see if that plays out in reality, but we are hopeful that we will be able to do so. It's these kinds of assurances that we need. Also, that we will have unhindered access, as I said, that we can deliver aid based on needs alone, and that we won't need to discriminate in any way based on gender or ethnic group.
Lala Mater, Advocacy and Media Director of the Norwegian Refugee Council, speaking to us from Oslo. Madam, thank you for sharing your views with us. Well, the Taliban is still facing armed resistance in the Panjshir Valley. The mountainous enclave is 150 kilometers north of Kabul, and it's Afghanistan's most important stronghold of armed anti-Taliban forces. Since the capital fell, it's been the only province to hold out against the group. The area also resisted Taliban rule during the 1990s. There's been more fighting after talks between the two sides failed to reach a settlement. Dozens of people have been killed. Rob McBride is in Kabul and has more now on the situation in Panjshir Valley.
This standoff and the clashes have been continuing, and the Taliban and its units pretty much have the whole of this valley surrounded. They also are saying that they are putting pressure on this pocket by pressuring various strategic points around the valley. For their part, the resistance force inside the valley say they have been putting up a fierce defense, claiming to have killed and injured scores of Taliban fighters. But the fighting continues, and especially especially with the breakdown of talks. Now, talks have been ongoing for days now at trying to find some peaceful resolution of this, some sort of way for the resistance to surrender. As resistance has given way throughout Afghanistan, this remains basically the only pocket of armed resistance now to the Taliban. But according to the Taliban, they've been holding talks with the leader, Ahmad Massoud, the leader of the resistance, and they say that the reason for these talks breaking down were completely irrational demands from Massoud and the resistance fighters that he is leading. They say that, for example, they have demanded that as part of any peaceful resolution of this, the force be allowed to hold on to all of their weapons. Now, that isn't too outlandish, but then according to the Taliban, this group has also demanded a third of the representation in the Taliban's new government, which does